Welcome back. I'm Logan, your host for the Daily Bible Reading Podcast, where we are journeying through the Bible chronologically, taking it one day at a time. Today is day number 96, and we are going to be finishing the book of Judges today with Judges chapter 19 to 21. Parents, be warned, if you're listening to this in the car, this is a tough couple of chapters. You may want to listen to it on your own without little ears around. But before we get started, let's pray. This prayer comes from Piercing Heaven, Prayers of the Puritans by Robert Elmer. This prayer is entitled, Make Me Useful Again, and it's by Philip Doddridge. You are the bountiful Father and sovereign author of all good, whether natural or spiritual. I bless you for the talents with which you have enriched me, and which I do not deserve. But my soul is in shambles before you when I consider how little I have put them to good use. Compared to what you might reasonably have expected, what have I done with all the gifts you bestowed? The abilities, time, talents, possession, and influence. Through my own negligence and foolishness, the only result is a barren wilderness, where I might have seen a fruitful field and abundant harvest. I deserve to be stripped of everything and brought to immediate account, condemned for unfaithfulness to you, to the world, to my own soul. I ought to be cast into the prison of eternal darkness. But you, Lord, have freely forgiven the dreadful debt of 10,000 talents. I adore you for this. Accept my renewed surrender, Lord. I again submit myself and all that I have to serve you. I admit that I give you only what is your own to begin with. Make me a faithful steward for my great Lord, I beg you, and do not let me consider my own interests, those opposing yours. I adore you, God of all grace. Let me feel a love for others rise in my soul. Open my heart so I may reach out to serve. Help me to be fair and thankful in determining what is my own share, the portion you intend for me and my family. For the rest, help me to faithfully, cheerfully, and wisely distribute your bounty to those who need it most. Guide my hand, ever merciful Father. I am honored to be your instrument. And if it is your gracious will, would you also multiply the seed sown and prosper me in order that I may have even more to give to those in need? And then would you lead me on to the place of unlimited plenty and compassion, where I may see many that I had helped on earth, and, if it is your will, also many of those whom I introduced to saving faith. They will entertain me in their home of glory. In time and eternity, Lord, accept the praise of all through Jesus Christ, at whose feet I would bow. And in the end, after I have run my course, I will die at his feet, worshiping him then with sincere humility and gratitude, as if for the first time. Amen. All right, it's time to wrap up the book of Judges. We are in chapter 19 to 21. As I said before, this section of Judges is pretty dark, and so be warned. However, let's go ahead and get into it. Chapter 19. In those days, when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And his concubine was unfaithful to him, and she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there some 4 months. Then her husband arose and went after her, to speak kindly to her and bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys, and she brought him into her father's house. And when the girl's father saw him, he came with joy to meet him. And his father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and spent the night there. And on the 4th day they arose in the morning, And he prepared to go. But the girl's father said to his son-in-law, "Strengthen your heart with a morsel of bread, and after that you may go." So the two of them sat and ate and drank. And the girl's father said to the man, "Be pleased to spend the night, and let your heart be merry." And when the man rose up to go, his father-in-law pressed him, till he spent the night there again. And on the 5th day he arose early in the morning to depart. And the girl's father said, "Strengthen your heart, and wait until the day declines." So they ate, both of them. And when the man and his concubine and his servant rose up to depart, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, "Behold, now the day has waned toward evening. Please spend the night. Behold, the day draws to its close. Lodge here, and let your heart be merry. And tomorrow you shall arise early in the morning for your journey, and go home." But the man would not spend the night. He rose up and departed, and arrived opposite Jebus, that is, Jerusalem. He had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. When they were near Jebus, the day was nearly over, and the servant said to his master, "Come now, let us turn aside to this city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it." And his master said to him, "We will not turn aside into the city of foreigners, who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will pass on to Gibeah." And he said to his young man, "Come and let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night at Gibeah or at Ramah." So they passed on and went their way. And the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. And they turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah. And he went in and sat down in the open square of the city, for no one took them into his house to spend the night. And behold, an old man was coming from his work in the field at evening. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim, and he was sojourning in Gibeah. The men of the place were Benjaminites. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, "Where are you going, and where do you come from?" And he said to him, "We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim from which I come. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and I am going to the house of the Lord, but no one has taken me into his house. We have straw and feed for our donkeys, with bread and wine for me and your female servant and the young man with your servants. There is no lack of anything." And the old man said, "Peace be to you. I will care for all your wants. Only do not spend the night in the square." So he brought him into his house and gave the donkeys feed, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. As they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, "Bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him." And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, "No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly, since this man has come into my house. Do not do this vile thing. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now. Violate them and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man, do not do this outrageous thing." But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and made her go out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. And as morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was, until it was light. And her master rose up in the morning, and when he opened the door of the house and went out on his way, behold, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house, with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, "Get up, let us be going." But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man rose up and went away to his home. And when he entered his house, he took a knife, and taking hold of his concubine, he divided her, limb by limb, into 12 pieces, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And all who saw it said, "Such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak." Chapter 20. Then all the people of Israel came out, from Dan to Beersheba, including the land of Gilead. And the congregation assembled as one man to the Lord at Mizpah. And the chiefs of all the people, of all the tribes of Israel, presented themselves in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 men on foot that drew the sword. Now the people of Benjamin heard that the people of Israel had gone up to Mizpah. And the people of Israel said, Tell us, how did this evil happen?" And the Levite, the husband of the woman who was murdered, answered and said, "I came to Gibeah that belongs to Benjamin, I and my concubine, to spend the night. And the leaders of Gibeah rose against me and surrounded the house against me by night. They meant to kill me, and they violated my concubine, and she is dead. So I took hold of my concubine and cut her in pieces and sent her throughout all the country of the inheritance of Israel, for they have committed abomination and outrage in Israel. Behold, you people of Israel, all of you, give your advice and counsel here." And all the people arose as one man, saying, "None of us will go to his tent, and none of us will return to his house. But now this is what we will do to Gibeah. We will go up against it by lot. And we will take 10 men of 100 throughout all the tribes of Israel, and 100 of 1,000, and 1,000 of 10,000, to bring provisions for the people, that when they come, they may repay Gibeah of Benjamin for all the outrage that they have committed in Israel." So all the men of Israel gathered against the city, united as one man. And the tribes of Israel sent men throughout all the tribe of Benjamin, saying, "What evil is this that has taken place among you? Now therefore give up the men, the worthless fellows in Gibeah, that we may put them to death, and purge evil from Israel." But the Benjaminites would not listen to the voice of their brothers, the people of Israel. Then the people of Benjamin came together out of the cities of Gibeah to go out to battle against the people of Israel. And the people of Benjamin mustered out of their cities on that day 26,000 men who drew the sword, besides the inhabitants of Gibeah, who mustered 700 chosen men. Among all these were 700 chosen men who were left-handed. Every one could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. And the men of Israel, apart from Benjamin, mustered 400,000 men who drew the sword. All these were men of war. The people of Israel arose and went up to Bethel and inquired of God, "Who shall go up first for us to fight against the people of Benjamin?" And the Lord said, "Judah shall go up first." Then the people of Israel arose in the morning and encamped against Gibeah. And the men of Israel went out to fight against Benjamin. And the men of Israel drew up the battle line against them at Gibeah. The people of Benjamin came out of Gibeah and destroyed on that day 22,000 men of the Israelites. But the people, the men of Israel, took courage and again formed the battle line in the same place where they had formed it on the first day. And the people of Israel went up and wept before the Lord until evening. And they inquired of the Lord, "Shall we again draw near to fight against our brothers, the people of Benjamin?" And the Lord said, "Go up against them." So the people of Israel came near against the people of Benjamin the second day. And Benjamin went against them out of Gibeah the second day, and destroyed 18,000 men of the people of Israel. All these were men who drew the sword. Then all the people of Israel, the whole army, went up and came to Bethel and wept. They sat there before the Lord and fasted that day until evening, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, for the ark of the covenant of God was there in those days. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, ministered before it in those days, saying, "Shall we go out once more to battle against our brothers, the people of Benjamin, or shall we cease?" And the Lord said, "Go up, for tomorrow I will give them into your hand." So Israel set men in ambush around Gibeah, and the people of Israel went up against the people of Benjamin on the third day, and set themselves in array against Gibeah, as at other times. And the people of Benjamin went out against the people, and were drawn away from the city. And as at other times, they began to strike and kill some of the people in the highways, one of which goes up to Bethel, and the other to Gibeah, and in the open country, about 30 men of Israel. And the people of Benjamin said, "They are routed before us, as at the first." But the people of Israel said, "Let us flee, and draw them away from the city to the highways." And all the men of Israel rose up out of their place, and set themselves in array at Baal-Tamar. And the men of Israel who were in ambush rushed out of their place from Maareh-Gibbah, and there came against Gibeah 10,000 chosen men out of all Israel. And the battle was hard, but the Benjaminites did not know that disaster was close upon them. And the Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and the people of Israel destroyed 25,100 men of Benjamin that day. All these were men who drew the sword. So the people of Benjamin saw that they were defeated. The men of Israel gave ground to Benjamin, because they trusted the men in ambush whom they had set against Gibeah. Then the men in ambush hurried and rushed against Gibeah. The men in ambush moved out and struck all the city with the edge of the sword. Now the appointed signal between the men of Israel and the men in the main ambush was that when they made a great cloud of smoke rise up out of the city, the men of Israel should turn in battle. Now Benjamin had begun to strike and kill about 30 men of Israel. They said, "Surely they are defeated before us, as in the first battle." But when the signal began to rise out of the city in a column of smoke, the Benjaminites looked behind them, and behold, the whole of the city went up in smoke to heaven. Then the men of Israel turned, and the men of Benjamin were dismayed, for they saw that disaster was close upon them. Therefore they turned their backs before the men of Israel in the direction of the wilderness. But the battle overtook them, and those who came out of the cities were destroying them in their midst. Surrounding the Benjaminites, they pursued them and trod them down from Nohah as far as opposite Gibeah on the east. 18,000 men of Benjamin fell, all of them men of valor, and turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon. 5,000 men of them were cut down in the highways, and they were pursued hard to get them, and 2,000 men of them were struck down. So all who fell that day of Benjamin were 25,000 men who drew the sword, all of them men of valor. But 600 men turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, and remained at the rock of Rimmon 4 months. And the men of Israel turned back against the people of Benjamin, and struck them with the edge of the sword, the city, men and beasts, and all that they found. And all the towns that they found they set on fire. Chapter 21. Now the men of Israel had sworn at Mizpah, "No one of us shall give his daughter in marriage to Benjamin." And the people came to Bethel, and sat there till evening before God, and they lifted up their voices, and wept bitterly. And they said, "O Lord, the God of Israel, why has this thing happened in Israel, that today there should be one tribe lacking in Israel?" And the next day the people rose early, and built there an altar, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. And the people of Israel said, "Which of all the tribes of Israel did not come up in the assembly to the Lord?" For they had taken a great oath concerning him who did not come up to the Lord to Mizpah, saying, "He shall surely be put to death." And the people of Israel had compassion for Benjamin their brother, and said, "One tribe is cut off from Israel this day. What shall we do for wives of those who are left, since we have sworn by the Lord that we will not give them any of our daughters for wives?" And they said, "What one is there of the tribes of Israel that did not come up to the Lord to Mizpah?" And behold, no one had come to the camp from Jabesh Gilead to the assembly. For when the people were mustered, behold, not one of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead was there. So the congregation sent 12,000 of their bravest men there, and commanded them, "Go and strike the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead with the edge of the sword, also the women and the little ones. This is what you shall do. Every male and every woman that is lain with a male you shall devote to destruction." And they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had not known a man by lying with him. And they brought them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. Then the whole congregation sent word to the people of Benjamin, who were at the rock of Rimmon, and proclaimed peace to them. And Benjamin returned at that time. And they gave them the women, whom they had saved alive from the women of Jabesh Gilead. But they were not enough for them. And the people had compassion on Benjamin, because the Lord had made a breach in the tribes of Israel. Then the elders of the congregation said, "What shall we do for wives for those who are left, since the women are destroyed out of Benjamin?" And they said, "There must be an inheritance for the survivors of Benjamin, that a tribe not be blotted out from Israel. Yes, we cannot give them wives from our daughters, for the people of Israel had sworn, 'Cursed be he who gives a wife to Benjamin.' So they said, 'Behold, there is the yearly feast of the Lord at Shiloh, which is north of Bethel, on the east of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem, and south of Lebanah.' And they commanded the people of Benjamin, saying, 'Go and lie in ambush in the vineyards, and watch. If the daughters of Shiloh come out to dance in the dances, then come out of the vineyards, and snatch each man his wife from the daughters of Shiloh, and go to the land of Benjamin. And when their fathers or their brothers came out to complain to us, we will say to them, grant them graciously to us, because we did not take for each man of them his wife in battle, neither did you give them to them, else you would now be guilty. And the people of Benjamin did so, and took their wives according to their number, from the dancers whom they carried off. Then they went and returned to their inheritance, and rebuilt the towns, and lived in them. And the people of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family, and they went out from there, every man to his inheritance. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. You know, this isn't the first podcast I've ever made. I've done several others with friends in the past, going all the way back to pretty much the beginning of podcasting. And normally it's a very arduous and time-consuming process of recording and editing and mixing and finding music that you can use on the podcast and sound clips and things like that to try to put it all together to make a nice finished product. But Anchor.fm makes that all so much easier. I use Anchor. It is free, and the creation tools that they allow me to use to record and edit the podcast right from my phone or right on my computer, right through my web browser, just make it absolutely effortless. This is an amazing product that they offer, absolutely free. And so if you're looking to start a podcast, looking to get anything going, if you've got a great idea, I encourage you, get out there and do it with Anchor.fm. My favorite part about the entire process with Anchor is that they will actually distribute the podcast for me. So whenever I'm done, whenever I'm all finished recording, I just hit done and I tell them when I want it to be published. And it magically goes out to places like Spotify and Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts and everywhere else that you guys listen to. So it's magical. And you can even make money from your podcast when you get listeners, folks start listening to your podcast. As many people as are listening to the ads that you record, like this one, you end up getting paid for those things. And so it's everything that you need to make a podcast all in one place. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, which I would encourage anybody to do, you've got a voice. We want your voice to be heard. Go and download the free Anchor app now, or go to Anchor.fm to get started. Is it fair for me to say that I'm done with this book? Like, I recognize that this is scripture and that God is being honest about the things that are happening during this time. But reading today, my stomach was turning and churning from the wickedness and the sin that is on display here. And this is the point. It's the point of the book as we end this cycle of sin and degradation and we go downward. Recognize that this isn't all chronological, okay? We started a new section in the book back in chapter 17 as we begin to enter into this new phrase of there was no king in Israel. In those days, there was no king in Israel. No king in Israel. We see it repeated over and over again, and people are doing what's right in their own eyes. Well, the reason why this is written this way is because the book of Judges, at least this section of the book of Judges, was written when there was a king in Israel. Okay, it's being written maybe by David or by Samuel after he is bringing the king into the kingdom. And so it's contrasting the day and age when they do have a king and looking at the good, just judgment of a king versus the time when there was no king. To tell the people, hey, remember, this is what it looked like before we had a king. We need to have a governor. Without someone to tell us what to do, if we won't follow God, then we need someone to tell us what to do, or else we will just do whatever we feel is right in our own eyes. And so in chapter 17 and 18, we saw, the idolatry in a family expands to the idolatry of the whole tribe of Dan. And then in chapters 19 to 21, we get what I think is one of the most despicable stories in the whole Bible. It is disgusting, the amount of sin and idolatry and twistedness that goes on in this story. It is a stomach-churning incident, and some have labeled it the Sodom and Gomorrah of Israel. And this is after we've come into the land of Israel. Once again, this is not a chronological event, because in chapter 20 we see who the high priest was at the time. It's actually Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, who was the son of Aaron. Okay, so this is third generation of high priests. The book of Judges stretches for about 400 years total. Well, this would have been in the first 100 of those years. So this was an earlier story of things that had happened, but we're getting it tacked on here at the end of the book for one of a few reasons. One, it could have been added on to the end of the book to show this further spiral and cycle downward, that it's listed last to leave us on a note of helplessness and a need for a king that's going to be answered when we get into the book of Ruth and 1st and 2nd Samuel that's coming up. And so it leads us in a very dramatic and narrative way to desire leadership that will be different from this kind of leadership. Second, it also could be added on at the end because it was written later than the original content of the book of Judges. A lot of people think this because of the cities that are mentioned here. If this was written during the time of King David, it could have been written by a scribe or by David himself to criticize and to call into question Saul's rule as king. Because, remember, David is from Bethlehem, where we find a man who is hospitable, and later in the story we see Gibeah in the tribe of Benjamin. Well, who was from the tribe of Benjamin but King Saul? And so this could have been written by a scribe later on to try to denigrate Saul's rule and say that he was not actually a good king after all, because he was one of those Benjaminites. He was from the tribe that brought about this horrible incident in the history of Israel. And while I'm ready to be done reading the book of Judges, I am so excited for tomorrow to look ahead to the book of Ruth. I'm sad that we're reading the entire book of Ruth in one day, and we only get one day to look at one of my favorite stories in all of the Old Testament. It's a super cool story. I am excited for it, and I hope you are too. I hope you'll invite people to listen, because really, this is such an amazing book. It's such a gripping narrative story that we get after a slog of going through the book of Judges. It's like God said, here's a little gift for you. You made it through Judges. You made it through the dark period. You made it through all of these horrible stories of these judges who really didn't know their right hand from their left. And now you're going to see what justice and mercy and goodness really looks like. So excited to get into Ruth with you tomorrow. But as it is today, we're here in this story in Judges, and it's a despicable tale where we see a Levite who takes a concubine, which is really just a low-class wife during this time, and she runs away, whether it's because he's abusive or whatever might be going on. But she runs away, goes back home, and he goes to get her from Bethlehem after several months. And we see her father being very hospitable toward him, probably because he was embarrassed at the behavior of his daughter. So after they finally leave, they are making their journey, and they nearly turn aside to the town of Jerusalem, or Jebus, during that time. And honestly, it probably would have been better for them to do this, because now we know what happens in Gibeah in a few moments. Maybe this wouldn't have happened if they would have gone to the Jebusites. I think the author here is trying to make a comparison and say that it might have been better to be outside of the people of Israel rather than staying within them in this one circumstance. But instead, they go to Gibeah and they stay there. And while they are there, they are given some hospitality by this old man who brings them in, says, hey, you do not want to be in the town square at night. Hey, let's get to my house. So they go home. But we see a repeat of what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. We see these worthless men of the city, these literally men of Belial, these worthless men, come and they call out this man and say, hey, come out so that we may know him. We may have sex with him. This is homosexuality. This is perversion on display. But instead, the man sends out this concubine that he has just gone and gotten back. And as they molest her and rape her and murder her over the night, he remains inside, nothing happens, and she dies. This is a dark story. He collects her body the next morning, throws it across one of his donkeys. When he gets home, he decides he's going to chop her body up into 12 pieces. She's been defiled. He is unclean. She is unclean. The whole nation now is going to be unclean because he sends these 12 pieces of her body across the nation to the 12 tribes and calls essentially a big meeting of the tribes of Israel together to confront this evil, which it needed to be confronted. There was a massive problem that was going on here in Benjamin. But is it worth going to a civil war and destroying an entire tribe over? That's a big question. Does the punishment match the crime that was committed here? Yes, it is despicable that one concubine was murdered and raped in a town. But is that worth nearly 50,000 people dying and wiping out a whole tribe of Israel for it, nearly? As they go on and they do finally get control over the people of Benjamin, they recognize that they've almost wiped them out, and they've lost just as many people from the tribes of Judah and others, these faithful tribes, during this war. And so they continue to go deeper in their horrible thinking, and they decide to wipe out another city and take the virgins that are remaining from that city and give them over to the remaining men of Benjamin that are left. These 600 men of Benjamin that are left. And that's still not even enough. And so, though they had given vows not to give any of their daughters in marriage to the people of Benjamin, they tell them to lay in wait during a festival, whether this is the Feast of Tabernacles or Pentecost or whether it's some pagan festival, we don't know. But these virgin girls would come out and dance. These unmarried girls would come out and dance. And during that time, they essentially gave them the green light to go and kidnap women, take them from their families, and make them their wives. This is sick. It's disgusting what is going on. And it's a reminder that the things that we read in Scripture are not prescriptive. Okay, God is not saying to do any of these things, but he is being dramatically honest about the evil and the wickedness in human hearts. That when men and women do the things that they see to be right, this is the kind of stuff that happens. And so we trust in God to show us a better way, the right way. The book closes with this story with the people of Benjamin, these 600 remaining men, getting their wives to be able to rebuild their tribe. And we close out the book with the sentence that we have repeated over and over again since chapter 17. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This is causing us to long for and look for a good king who knows justice and righteousness and mercy, and who can lead his people into those things. Thankfully, we're going to get into a better story tomorrow. Thank you for joining me today. I hope this has been encouraging to you. If so, please let me know by visiting the links that you find under the Connect With Us section in the show notes. I'm a simple man and I could use the encouragement. If you've been blessed enough that you would like to support the podcast, I would greatly appreciate that as well. You can go to buymeacoffee.com/DBR podcast to make either a one-time gift or to sign up for a monthly recurring membership gift. Until tomorrow, keep reading and keep worshiping.